Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and verify our certificates with Cloud Hardware Security module. Now, before we begin, I want to explain it at a very high level. So I'm basically taking what's in the AWS documentation and animating it, making it a lot more accessible for you. So we have a whole bunch of different certificates that we just downloaded. We downloaded the AWS root certificate as well as the manufacturer's root certificate. We got that from the manufacturer's website. And then when we created our cluster, we essentially got 4 certificates. So we got our AWS hardware certificate, and this certificate basically just tells us that AWS own the hardware. And then we got our manufacturer's hardware certificate, and this certificate basically tells us that the manufacturer manufactured the hardware. And then we got our cluster's hardware security module. And this consists of 2 certificates. So our hardware security modules certificate was created when we initialized our cluster's hardware virtual security module device. And basically, essentially, this certificate is certifying that the cluster's hardware security module provisioned the virtual device. And then we have our cluster CSR. And our cluster CSR is the thing that we need to sign in order to initialize the cluster. So by the end of this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to have signed a cluster CSR, and then we'll be able to go in and initialize the cluster. Before we log into our Linux instance, let's talk about how we can verify our certificates. So we're going to start with our AWS root certificate. We're then going to essentially create a chain. So we're going to add that to our hardware certificate. We're literally just concatenating them together, and that will form our AWS chain certificate. So it's our root certificate plus our hardware certificate. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use OpenSSL with our HSM certificate, and we're going to compare our HSM certificate with our AWS chain certificate, and we're going to use a command, and if all is okay, we're going to get the HSM certificate.crt okay. So let's go ahead and do that now. I do realize this looks a bit complicated, but it is lots of fun, and as we go through it, it'll make a lot more sense. So let's go ahead and verify our hardware security module certificate with AWS. You'll need to log into the EC2 instance in your public subnet. Okay, so I've logged into my EC2 instance. If I just go ahead and do ls, in here we can see a whole bunch of different certificates. So we've got my root certificate from AWS, we've got my manufacturer's root certificate, we then got my AWS hardware certificate, we then have my cluster CSR, my HSM certificate, and then my manufacturer's hardware certificate, and then I've got my private key, which has no real bearing on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to start creating certificate chains, and then we're going to go in and validate that these chains are okay. So the first one we're going to start with is the AWS chain. So the way to do this is we're going to type in a bunch of commands, but if you remember I showed you earlier on, if we just type in cat and then the name of a file, it will basically output that file or read that file for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the cat command, but then we're going to open up 2 files and we're going to send them to a 3rd file, which becomes our certificate chain. So again, I'm just going to clear the screen, type in ls. These will all be in the resources section of the course, the commands that I'm running. It's also in the AWS documentation on Cloud HSM tutorials. To save yourself a lot of time, just highlight this. So starting from cluster, going over to this the end of the cluster ID, copy that into your clipboard and go back over to your notepad editor. Okay, so I've got my text file in here. It's called certificate chains. But go ahead and just do a control F on the cluster ID. Essentially what I want to do is just find and replace my cluster ID, and I want to replace it with the following. So cluster hyphen and then the cluster thing, and go ahead and hit replace all. Once you've done that, it's only done 1 replacement, so I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again and replace all by highlighting it all. So that is now done. So we're going to do our commands one at a time. I'm going to copy this into my clipboard. So what we're doing here is essentially we're opening both our certificates. We're opening our hardware certificate and our Cloud HSM root certificate, and then what we're going to do is we're going to pipe that over to a new certificate that we're going to call AWS chain.crt. So it will create a new certificate. So let's paste that into our clipboard and hit enter. If we now type in ls, we'll be able to see our new certificate, which is this one here. So it's our AWS chain certificate. Again, I'm going to clear the screen to make this simple. Back over to our notepad editor, and we're going to now use OpenSSL to verify this file. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare our AWS chain certificate against our AWS hardware security module certificate. And if that works, we should get an OK. So let's go ahead and hit paste and hit enter, and look, there we go. So it says that it's OK. So we know that these certificates are all lining up in essence. So let's go back over and do exactly the same thing with our manufacturer's hardware certificate and their root certificate. So go in and paste that in here. We're going to concatenate it and create a new chain. So if we type in ls, we'll be able to see our manufacturer's chain, which is here. There's our change certificate. Again, I'm going to clear the screen to make it easy to follow along. And I'm going to go back over to Text Wrangler, and we're going to use OpenSSL to verify that this certificate chain is correct and that it's going to match back to our hardware security module certificate. And there we go, we've got an OK. Now, if you didn't get two OKs, something has gone wrong. I would not trust your hardware security module. I'd decommission it and recommission it. So it's entirely up to you. So to recap, we've taken our root certificate, we've added it to our hardware certificate, we've created a chain, which was a new certificate, and then we've used OpenSSL to verify that chain against our hardware security module certificate, and we got OK. We then did exactly the same with the manufacturer's root certificate and their hardware certificate. We then created a chain and we used OpenSSL to verify it. Now what we want to do is we want to take our HSM certificate and our cluster CSR, and essentially what we're going to do is try and sign our cluster's CSR. So to do that, what we need to do is we're going to use OpenSSL to extract the public key for our HSM certificate. We're going to use OpenSSL to extract the public key for our cluster's CSR, and they should both equal each other. It should be exactly the same key. So let's go ahead and do that now. So to extract the public key for our hardware certificate, we're just going to use this this command here. So OpenSSL x509, we're going to use our cluster's HSM certificate. We're going to extract the public key, and we're going to create it to this new thing called HSM certificate public key. So I'm just going to copy that into my clipboard and go back over to terminal. Clear the screen here just to keep things simple. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. If we type in ls, we'll be able to see our new public key here. So that's our hardware security module certificates public key. Again, let's go back over to Text Wrangler. And I'm going to do exactly the same with my Amazon key. So, my certificate CSR. So I'm going to copy and paste that into here and paste it into terminal and hit enter. That will now generate a new public key for my cluster's CSR. So you can see it here. So I've got my cluster's CSR and I've got my HSM certificates public key. These two public keys should be exactly the same. And the way we verify that is we just compare the differences between the two. And so if we go and hit copy and we hit paste, and this should basically show that there's no difference between the two. So it should come up as empty, which it has done. So we know now that we can use these certificates. So I know it can be really complicated, but I'll just remind you again what we did. So is the cluster hardware security module, when we provisioned it, we got a HSM certificate and we got our cluster's CSR. What we need to do is go in and sign this, but we also needed to verify that the public keys matched each other. So that's essentially exactly what we did. We used OpenSSL to extract our public keys, and we then checked that they were identical, which they are. So we are now ready to go on and start initializing our cluster. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.